fine. So when we set up research strategies, we want to make sure that we can actually provide accurate conclusions and then make sure those conclusions fit what we've seen. This comic here, I want to demonstrate a point here. So if you have two stick figures there, presumably both male, the person says, wow, you suck at math. And then in the second frame there, you've got a male, someone who's male on the left and someone who seems to be female on the right. And the person saying, wow, girls suck at math. And this is like a really good demonstration of how our conclusions can vary a great deal based on a very small shift in a certain feature or variable or whatever like this. Obviously, the conclusion on the left and the conclusion on the right are very separate. Obviously, judging someone solely by their biological sex with regard to their skills is ridiculous. So we want to really avoid those kind of conclusions. We want to make sure that our research is valid, as are our conclusions. So construct validity, there's a lot on here. I'm not going to waste too much time discussing all of it, but essentially, does the instrument measure what it's supposed to measure? That's the essential question. Does it measure what it's supposed to measure? The SAT, for example, has excellent validity, right? Construct validity, because it is actually very good at measuring scholastic aptitude, which is why it's called the SAT, Scholastic Aptitude Test. Right? So in this case, we're seeing an instrument that does have very good construct validity, but you would actually be surprised at how often the construct that's trying to be measured isn't measured with something that's effective for it. So a lot of students who take the SAT believe that the SAT is actually a intelligence test, and in fact, it's not. It would actually have very poor construct validity if it was utilized as an intelligence test. So some things we want to consider about this, though, right? So, for example, you might have a straight A senior who gets a 960 out of 1600, right? A C student who gets a 1480, which is a very high score, way above the national average, right? And what we see is there's going to be certain things that pertain to this, right? So does the test actually measure intelligence? The answer is no, right? Arguably, a straight A senior would probably be smarter than a C student junior, but we don't. It's not a measure of intelligence at all, and that's why it throws people off, because this sort of pattern happens very frequently. And then likewise, too, is it a measure of scholastic aptitude? If you have a situation where a student fails out of college in the first semester despite a 1410, I use this example because it happened to one of my very good friends, right? And then a student who makes a dean's list as a freshman despite a 1020 on the SAT. Likewise, this is one of my other friends. So does it actually really measure scholastic aptitude? The answer to that question is yes, it really does. It measures what it's entitled to measure. However, the big however, is it is still subject to outliers, which are data, essentially data that deviates from the norm. These two examples, actually all four of those examples, deviate from the norm that we see in the SAT. What you also want to be aware of is that just because something has good construct validity does not mean that it doesn't also have confounds. So the example we've used in previous lectures is ice cream sales and violent crime. Obviously, there's the confound of temperature, right? So in this case, ice cream sales and violent crime have nothing statistically to do with each other, but in reality, they actually have an R value of correlation of like 0.95 or something like that, something ridiculous. And essentially what it boils down to is there's a confound, in this case temperature, that makes both go up. So when it's hotter outside, people are more inclined to buy ice cream, right? And when it's hot outside, people have a tendency to be more aggressive/violent. So temperature is driving both these variables. In this case, temperature is a confound. In the examples I just gave you, right? So a straight A senior who gets a 960, maybe that's down to test anxiety. That could be the confound we're seeing here. C student who junior gets a 1480, maybe they just really prepped very hard. They knew their GPA wasn't particularly good, so they were trying to make sure their SAT score was. The student who fails out of college, right? My friend, it was down to partying. The SAT doesn't account for the fact that some people just go out and party all the time, right? And then for the 1020 there, this student, my friend, had a serious fear of failure. So even though he didn't do great on the SAT, he really worked very hard in college to be successful. So some threats too that we want to think about construct validity. We haven't talked about the placebo effect yet, but I really want us to consider that, right? So if I'm trying to think of a good example. Advil. If we were trying to test the effectiveness of Advil in getting rid of headaches, right? We could have participants take Advil and see how they report their symptoms going down, their headache symptoms going down, okay? And you would think, okay, well, that's a good way, that's good construct validity. We're asking them if their headache is going away after taking a headache medicine. True. However, the placebo effect could also be a confound in this situation, right? The placebo effect being the fact that knowing that you have done something creates its own outcomes, right? So, and I'm sure you've been there before. You have a headache, you pop some Advil, you take a big drink of water, and you put the cup down and you think, oh, I already feel a little bit better. It's already making my headache feel a little bit better. It is not. That is ridiculous. Those sort of medicines take like half an hour at least to get through your system because they have to be digested, enter your bloodstream, and move to the place where there's pain relief required. So when you say, oh, I already feel better, that is truly a placebo effect. However, it doesn't mean you don't feel better, right? Where many people misunderstood the placebo effect or misunderstand the placebo effect is they think it's complete nonsense that you just tell yourself you feel better. In fact, research has indicated that you do physically feel better based on a placebo effect. There was an incredible study done probably 10 years ago, but they actually gave terminal cancer patients who were basically beyond treatment, a placebo. And a couple of them out of this study actually remitted, which is just unbelievable. Partially because, at least not partially, substantially because of the placebo effect. The problem with this is the placebo effect really interferes with construct validity, right? So the actual medication, so when you take the Advil, is the Advil actually having the effect or is it the placebo effect? And that little kind of theoretical equation down there at the bottom kind of helps you to get to the bottom of this. So the effect of the actual medication minus the placebo effect is what's going to give you the construct validity. Basically, how effective is the Advil? If we consider this Advil, right? If you give Advil to one group, the actual medication, you give a placebo to another group. You ask both groups how their headache feels half an hour later, and you subtract the placebo group from the actual Advil group. That's going to give you the construct validity and essentially give you the efficacy of the Advil. That will tell you exactly how well Advil works. Because what you're doing is you're essentially controlling for the placebo effect. You're subtracting that placebo effect from there and you're saying, look, even beyond a placebo effect, this is how well this medication works, right? And what you might find, I mean, I would love to see the research on this. What you might find is there's a lot of medicine we probably take that doesn't do much beyond a placebo effect. When I was a kid, my sister used to complain about headaches. She didn't actually have headaches, to my knowledge, but she used to complain about headaches. And my mom would give her a Tic Tac because my sister didn't know that Tic Tacs were candy. She thought they were headache medicine. And she'd pop them, crunch it up like this, right? And then she'd be like, oh, my head already feels better. That's so nice. And that was it. And what's interesting is I actually think that there was probably a part of her that did feel better after taking the placebo, right? The power of the placebo, I can't emphasize enough. I'd really invite you to do some further exploration on that. Some other threats, right? What we might also see is how we're only examining one variable, right? So we might say, okay, there's a new psychological treatment that's available, right? So a new type of therapy that's available. And you have one therapist administer that new type of treatment, right? And it's unsuccessful. In that case, you don't know if it was actually the treatment type that was unsuccessful or if it was the therapist that was unsuccessful. What would be a better examination is if you had several different therapists administering this new treatment type. As you see at the very bottom there, treatment type by expert, right? By multiple experts, not just a single treatment type. Right? And this would allow you to be able to say, okay, well, you know what? It's really effective, but only if the therapist is trained in CBT, or only if the therapist is trained in ABA, or whatever, right? You can be more specific and say, this is an effective therapy, but it needs to be administered by this kind of therapist. So sometimes one of the threats to construct validity in this case is if you have what's called a single operation or narrow stimulus sampling. If you only have one therapist deliver the treatment, you might be inclined to think that it's not effective because of the narrow stimulus sampling that you did. Right? Ideally, you would have a broader or more inclusive stimulus sampling and then can truly identify whether or not the therapy type is effective or not. Oh, I just got ahead of myself. So that's how you address it. Use multiple therapists. Right? What you also might see, for example, once again with narrow stimulus sampling, is if you were to say, and actually I kind of outline it here. Let me go to the next slide. If I showed you a picture of this individual, okay, and said, tell me what you think about this guy's education level, I don't know, criminal record, credit history, demeanor, interests, whatever, right? Based on just this single piece of stimulus, a narrow stimulus sampling, you might provide all sorts of conclusions about this individual, right? And some of them might be right, some of them might be wrong, but would be very narrow stimulus. To really assess this person effectively, you would need to know more about them. Just visually alone, this is the same guy, right? One, he's got all of his tattoos hanging out, many of his tattoos hanging out. The other one, he's very nicely dressed at a movie premiere. Depending on the stimulus you delivered, if you only saw the picture on the right and not the picture on the left, your assessment of him would probably look very different. But having both pictures, you could get a better assessment. In this case, it's a broader stimulus sampling, not just a single stimulus sampling. I don't know if you recognize him. He's actually semi-famous. He's a motorcycle builder named Jesse James. He used to own a shop called West Coast Choppers out in SoCal. And he actually used to be married to Sandra Bullock, but cheated on her, which is just unacceptable. Sandra Bullock is a national treasure. I'm going to throw it out there. Let's move on. So other threats, we talked about this in the previous chapter. I'm going to throw this on here. So experimenter expectancies effect. In this case, the experimenter has an idea of what the study will show or an idea of what they want the study to show. And therefore, they unintentionally, I would underline that word, unintentionally impact its outcome. I tried to hit this point very hard in the last chapter when we discussed this. But please be clear, this is not someone who is deliberately trying to sway the study a certain way. This is an unintentional, involuntary, subconscious, however you want to describe it. But as we talked about last chapter, maybe emphasizing a desired response, subtly influencing the participants, something like that. And I used the example in the previous chapter too of decorating a baby's room to reflect how you want them, the things you want them to embrace. So even though you might not do it on purpose, you might put pretty pink things in a little girl's room or blue things in a boy's room, not because you insist on them having that favorite color, just it's a kind of subconscious thing. And in the end, they do. Threats, once again, we also talked about demand characteristics, and I really emphasized the interrogation room, but there's other things that can contribute to demand characteristics. One, just being in a lab, right? If you've ever been in a research lab as a participant, it can be kind of daunting, kind of scary. The ones at Texas A&M, for example, that part of the building is this like maze of very narrow hallways that are poorly lit. It's almost like being like in a rat's maze, for example. So it can be off-putting. If there's a mirror in the room, for example, you might convince yourself that it's a two-way mirror, that you can actually not see them, but they can see you. A tape recorder, even if it's not running. I know with tape recorder, nobody uses tape recorders anymore. But hidden cameras, people are always on the lookout for hidden cameras. You know, am I being watched? Am I being recorded? Right? Even just the familiarity of the environment. If you've never been in the environment in which you're doing the research, it can make a big difference because kind of being out of your element can be detrimental. A great example of this, going back to the SAT, students almost always take the SAT at a different high school than their own high school. So you're in a new classroom, in a new high school, with people that you don't know. That can actually create demand characteristics that can negatively impact your test score. So just throwing it out there. Lighting as well. All these things, and we talked about in the previous chapter, all these things come together in an interrogation room to try and trigger a confession. So when we actually look at the conclusions, right? So we want to make sure that we have what's called statistical conclusion validity. Basically, are we able to successfully connect our conclusions with the statistics that are achieved, the statistical analysis achieved? These two cartoons, I think, demonstrate this very well. On the left, the lady says, statistics say that religious people live longer, which is true. So I practice a different religion every day of the week to be sure I'm covered. In this case, she has data, but doesn't have statistical conclusion validity. The data does not support what she is saying. Actually, the statistics indicate that people who have a deep religious connection and are identified with their faith live longer. So in this case, she's bouncing from religion to religion. It's not going to provide her the benefits. Likewise, on the one on the right, the little boy is on an airplane that's got a lot of turbulence, and he says, I wish they didn't turn on that seatbelt sign so much. Every time they do, it gets bumpy. Right? And of course, as you know, it gets bumpy and then they turn the light on. So in this case, he has the data, the bumpiness, but is not achieving the correct conclusion. And that's what we want to be mindful of. We have to know how to read the data. Is it X leading to Y? Or is it in fact Y leading to X? Or is there a third variable of Z that's impacting both of them? The point of this all is to say, we want to make sure that the conclusions we draw are adequately supported by our statistics, but that we are also open to alternative, plausible hypotheses.